Okay, so third layer is information architecture. For reference, you should be able to go to, or should have gone to chapter 8, and basically looking at the objectives as it was laid out in chapter 8, we really wanted to try to provide a definition of organizational information architecture that includes its objectives, the necessity, and the relationship to the organization's information assurance baseline. Provide a description of the basic components of the model of organizational IA architecture, and then provide a description of the process for designing IA architecture within with the issues associated with the design. I had mentioned in a previous video about this concept of benchmarking and blueprinting and whatnot, and I wanted to make sure that we had a good discussion about that in this module or in this video. So I think for me, when I look at information assurance architecture, one of the most important things that I'm looking at as it relates to information assurance is that component of access control. I think that as we look at information assurance within an organization, we can really break it down to the most fundamental component, and that is of access control, right? Access control within an organization is usually controlled or can be controlled or maintained by really three components. A collection of policies, within that organization, the programs that implement those policies, and the technologies that are used to enforce it. So if we look at these three bullets as it relates to access control, it'll really help us develop our information assurance architecture as we move through the model. So if we look at the general application of access control, we can break it down into 4 components. First is identification. With identification, we're really talking about obtaining the identity of the entity or the individual or the user requesting access to a logical or a physical area. Because remember, with defense in depth, we're also concerned about physical security as well as logical security. So we must, the first thing that we have to process is identification. The second is authentication, which is confirming the individual's identity, confirming the identity of the entity that's requesting access. The third is authorization, and in that we're determining what actions that authenticated entity can perform in that physical or logical area. So the third is authorization. And then the fourth is accountability. In other words, we have to make sure that we have the ability to document the activities of the authorized individual and the system. Obviously, there's a lot of different tools and techniques that we can implement to accomplish these. You're familiar with several of them we've talked about, probably access control is most likely built on these three components that I would think are probably the most important. Or the principle, the key principle is least privilege. Right? Least privilege in that those individuals that are members of the organization can access the minimum amount of information for the minimum amount of time necessary. Need to know. Limit the user's access to specific information that is required to perform the currently assigned task, and then separation of duties. Separation of duties again requires that any significant task it be split up in such a way that one individual, that more than one individual is responsible for their completion. So if we look at access control applications, there's really four things that we're trying to accomplish: identification, authentication, authorization, and accountability. And key principles of this are that of least privilege, that the individual has access to the minimum amount of information for the minimum amount of time necessary. We need to know, and that the limits are placed on the user's access to specific information required to perform the currently assigned task, and then separation of duties. This prevents any one individual from having total control over any one transaction. So we look at categories of access control. It's fine, we'll see that, in my opinion. There are, break it down into 6 different categories of access control. One is deterrent. Second is preventive. Third is detective. The fourth is corrective. The fifth is recovery. And the sixth is compensating. So if we can break it down into these, you could break it down into these 6. And sometimes these work nicely, categories of access control: deterrence, prevention, detective, corrective, recovery, and compensating. But that doesn't mean that that's the only way of doing it. Another way of doing it is a 3-tiered approach, which might be easier for some, where break it down into management, operational, and technical. And that allows us to divide up those categories of access control into 3 categories as opposed to 6. Now, a little bit older and probably more familiar to most of us are the concepts of mandatory, discretionary, and non-discretionary. So you have mandatory access control, discretionary access control, non-discretionary access control. And if we look at mandatory access control, basically it's required that constructed and coordinated with data classification schemes that really rate each collection of information. The user and the data owners have limited control over access to that information. So mandatory access control requires require some sort of tiered access and labeling. Right, so you have public, confidential, secret for the user access. And then you would have the documents would have the same rating scheme, and an individual that had public access only could only read their level and down, but they could write. They could write their level and up. An individual that had secret or the highest level of access control clearance could read their level and down, but they would only be able to write at their level, and in this case, up. And the third being is that we would never want somebody with high security clearance to write something that an individual below them could read. So that would be what mandatory access control looked like as it relates to information technology or security, or that from the military. And then, there's a bunch of different ways of breaking it down using, 5-level classification that the military uses, unclassified, sensitive, but unclassified, confidential, secret, top secret. And you find that this allows for compartmentalization, and that the restriction of information to the very fewest people that need to know, right? So this is very much based on a need to know type of access control. And again, you can do this for yourselves. You can make it public, sensitive, classified, whatever. The key here is that there has to be some sort of security clearance built in. That it has to be clear and definitive. There should be no way that there's any confusion between the levels. There should be no overlap. There should be a clear delineation between the security clearances as well as the security classifications as well. They have to be clear and distinct. Non-discretionary control is sometimes referred to as, and this is where we have, or at now, a lot of organizations go to this role-based access control, which really provides accesses based on the job function within the organization. So if you're an accountant, you have access to whatever the accounting function has access to. This is very convenient, right? It's task-based, tied to a particular assignment or responsibility, or tied to the role that the user performs. Both of these things makes it much easier to maintain access control, maintain controls and restrictions. Rights are assigned to the role, not the person. So Betty that's working in accounting gets only the access that the accounting department has. If Betty transfers to receiving, hopefully they remove the accounting access and give her only this. Much easier, because there's obviously there would likely be a difference in the level of access that she would need to have to perform her job. So this makes it much easier. So that's mandatory access control and non-discretionary access control or role-based access control. That leaves discretionary access control. And discretionary access control is basically the ability to share resources in a peer-to-peer environment where the creator of the document or of the resource determines the level not only of the document, but who can access it as well. Utilize the document, utilize the whatever it is that they created and what they can do with it. Create. So if I create a document, and I can determine who I want to share it with and what rules around it they created, or they modify it, or they created, so forth and so on. So that's basically, the three most common categories of access control. How does that relate to security architecture? Number one, it lays the groundwork. Security architecture models really illustrate the security implementation within an organization. They can help organizations quickly make improvements through the adoption of standards. Some models are implemented into computer hardware and software, policies and practices, confidentiality of information, on the integrity of the information that's being processed, but it all rolls back to this access control. I had mentioned earlier that I wanted to share some of the common ones or some of the resources for you to get into IA architecture. And I'm going to point you right to the National Institute of Standards and Technologies because they have some really great ones. Number one, they're publicly available. So I want you to go check out 800-12, which is the Computer Security Handbook. It provides accountability. It talks about the topics of accountability. It talks about awareness, ethics. It talks about taking a multidisciplinary approach. Proportionality and then integration as well are also talked about. So I would start right here with 800-12. It talks about things like timeliness, right? Timeliness. It talks about, the concept of reassessment. And then also concept of democracy within the organization. In other words, not operating within a vacuum. And again, it breaks it down into three different types of categories, control categories: management, control category, operational and technical, which is kind of what we talked about earlier. Once you get done with 800-12, and you can use 800-12 almost for the entire plan, you should go look at 800-14. 800-14 is generally accepted principles and practices for information technology systems, and it really talks about recommended practices. Recommended practices, and it provides information on commonly acceptable information security principles. How you can go about directing the security team into development of a blueprint that's discussed here. Good resource to help you walk through. Also describes some of the philosophical principles in the security team and how it should integrate information security into processes. So it talks about integration as well. How it talks about supporting the organization's mission, integral elements of sound management, how to be cost effective or should be cost effective, security responsibilities outside the security function. Security responsibilities and accountability should be made explicit, and then how it requires a comprehensive approach and integrated approaches. And then talks about reassessment and talks about societal factors as well. So we want to look at that. After going to 18, I'm sorry, 14, we went to 18. 18 really talks about, is the guide for developing a security plan on federal information systems. We could make the connection at Bradenton Academy because it's regulated or has to comply with FERPA, and they may be accepting financial aid if that's how you want to go about it. Could be considered a federal information system in the broadest sense, but it really provides detailed methods for assessing, designing, and implementing controls. And also gives some good ideas for different size organizations, and it really is provides a good plan for planning activities for the overall information security planning process. And there are some templates in this one that you might find of interest. After 18, you can look at 30. 30 has a couple of revisions. I think you want to go to revision 1 would probably be the most current. And that's a guide for conducting risk assessments, and basically it provides some foundation for the risk assessment process. You could likely glean some information out of that for future sections. It contains both definitions and practical guidance for assessing and managing or mitigating risks identified with IT systems. It's organized into 3 chapters that basically explain the overall risk management process, as well as preparing for conducting the communication of risks. So that's 800-30, 800-53, 53A, revision 1, talks about recommended security controls for federal information systems. And really, we're talking about the system development lifecycle here. Should sound familiar to you. This is helpful in approach to security assessment for information systems. Basically, NIST has a comprehensive security control assessment program that really provides or guides organizations through the preparation for the assessment and the remediation of security controls. And that's something that you want to look at. If you want to try to go, so I think those are probably the best areas to look at. There's also COBIT out there. That's through Information Systems and Audit Control Association. If you're not a member, then you have to become a member to get access to that. You should also look at COSO. COSO is the Committee of Sponsoring Organizations of the Treadwell Commission. And really one of the major things that they were tasked with is identifying factors that cause fraudulent financial reporting and make recommendations to reduce its incidence. COSO helps organizations comply with Sarbanes-Oxley, which is commonly referred to as Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002, heavily weighted on effectiveness, the efficiency of operations, reliability, financial reporting, compliance with applicable laws and regulations, and it had a lot to do with things like the control environment, risk assessment, control activities, information and communications, and monitoring. So COSO is available as well. So, the IA architecture is not entirely complicated, but I think that if you went back to those resources, you would find that they serve you pretty well and will help clarify future sections going forward. All right, thank you very much. If you have any questions, go ahead and just post them right to the discussion module, or for the project, or feel free to email me as well.